At the Okoli Law Group, we specialize in producing justice. If you or a loved one in the Atlanta metro area is facing serious criminal charges, then you need serious legal representation.
The Okoli Law Group is here for you. The Okoli Law Group is here for us.
The Okoli Law Group. Serious legal representation.
Navigating through this spiritual journey is challenging. Healers need healers, trainers need trainers, and leaders need leaders too. If you're looking for a space that offers Reiki healing, emotional mastery, chakra healing, and even one-on-one spiritual consultation, visit us at todayswellness.com. Get all your spiritual needs met and just have someone you can actually talk to. Because whatever it is that you are seeking is also within you.
Peace, family. We are live again. Dynasty Mirror Search for Huru. Thank you all. Thank you so much for joining. Ebube should be joining us here shortly. Let me make sure he got the link. He said he got the link, but let me just make sure that he got the link. You got it. But it's been a minute. You know, I've been uploading. Here we go. Here's Ebube right here. Ebube, we're gonna go ahead and bring you on right now.
Yes,
how you doing, brother?
Man, everything's good. Everything's good, man. How's everything going?
Hey, it's been a minute. Hold on. Let me get this. Give me 1 second. I got, they got this new feature now. You can change. There you go. There we go. Okay.
Oh, how do I make mine wide like yours? That looks pretty cool.
You want it wide or you want the circle?
I got like a rectangular type of thing going on.
That better?
Yeah, that's cool. At least we're both in the same, space. That's cool.
Okay, or you want to go back to circle?
No. Let's go with the squares. I think the circles are kind of cool, kind of nifty.
Okay. You said go with the circle or go with the with the?
I think we should go with the squares. Squares are pretty cool.
Okay, there we go. Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
This is a square. No, this is a square. That rectangle. I wasn't really paying attention to math.
I think this is geometry, maybe.
Geometry, yeah, whatever. Yeah, so
yeah, rhombus.
yeah. But everybody, we are live again. Dynasty Mirror Search for Huru. We got our brother Ebube Okoli, our in-house lawyer, live with us. So we're going to be discussing today's topic. And I was in Abuja a couple of weeks ago. And this topic came up, we had this conversation with, in fact, you met Ifeanyi before, the lawyer in Abuja.
Yeah, we had some great conversations.
Yeah. So he brought up, will we be better off? Will we be better off, or were we better off under military dictatorship versus, I guess democratic leadership or whatever you want to call it, that we have right now. And some of his points that he brought up was the security issues that are going on right now in Nigeria in the north. That wasn't happening under military dictatorship. Would you agree, Ebube? Or, and I'm gonna pull up.
I mean, you did have things that were going on during the military era. You also had the Metasine in the northeastern part of the country. You had a lot of things going on during the military regime. Sometimes we tend to romanticize foregone errors, but the military regime had its own issues. And we're going to get into this later, of course, as we dive into it deeply and thoroughly. But sometimes we tend to romanticize past leaders. Mm-hmm. And the main issue with Nigeria is that Nigeria needs a cohesive vision that we all really believe in. Because currently Nigeria is several ancient nations put together very recently, and we as Nigerians haven't had a clearly articulable goal as to why we're together and why we're even, what does Nigeria stand for, right? We haven't articulated a clear position and a clear vision for that nation that we're all legitimately working towards, not just what we profess, but what we're working towards. So the culture of impunity, where people believe that they can merely just take from the state that mentality is going to be pervasive in the absence of a unified ideology as to why we're together as a nation. So we're going to I'm going to unpackage that a lot more as we get into things. But that's the issue right there in a nutshell.
But Ebube, go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I got your slide. Shouldn't be any technical difficulties tonight. I got your slide ready to roll. But go ahead and introduce yourself to people who are new and don't know who you are.
For those who don't know, my name is Attorney Ebube Okoli. I'm a Nigerian-born, American-trained geopolitical analyst. I'm also the managing attorney at the Okoli Law Group. We handle all sorts of serious legal issues. We do serious legal defense, and when I say serious, we do serious legal defense. Everything ranging from murder one down to armed robbery, down to traffic tickets. We successfully handle all of those cases. In regards to geopolitical analysis, I also give my geopolitical analysis. I hate to use the same phrase twice, on various issues and topics regarding the African continent and how Africa is, because all the nations at the end of the day are playing games of power. It's all like power. Like you've seen Game of Thrones, all the houses, if you will. There's the micro level and the macro level. And every nation is trying to attain and maintain as much power as they can in order to not be a victim of more powerful nations. So I discuss my analysis with that framework in mind of not necessarily good, not necessarily bad, but just where does this leave you in the game of power?
Kind of off topic, Ebube. I know this is off topic because you're a criminal defense attorney.
And you have to phrase those words carefully. I'm not a criminal attorney. That would be an attorney who commits crimes.
Okay, I'm sorry. You represent sometimes criminals.
I represent innocent people who
allegedly
charged of infractions by the state.
Okay, my bad. I'm sorry. You're right. Who's this?
No problem.
Oh, no. Somebody called me through Facebook. I gotta call you back. All right, my bad. Let me let them know I gotta call back. I'll call back. Yeah, call me through Facebook. You know, it is what it is. All right, so we'll spend a minute and 30 seconds on this. I just got to ask you since you're here.
Yes, sir.
Meaning we kind of talked offline about the Fannie Willis situation. That seems like that's going to go nowhere. What are your thoughts on the YSL trial? Minute and 30 seconds, they were getting back on topic. I just had to ask.
Let's do that. It's a cool slight deviation. So in regards to the YSL situation, now we have to remember that it's a RICO, which means that you don't have to necessarily commit the actual crimes that you're being charged with. You just have to be a part of an organization that they've deemed to be a criminal organization, and then they can kind of rope you in. So it's one of those funny laws. It was designed actually initially to take down the mob, because the Godfathers would never go out and break people's kneecaps and do all sorts of atrocities in the community. It was always their underlings at their behest. So they said, we need a law that can actually go after the people who are running these criminal enterprises, which means it's a very powerful tool because you can basically be held responsible for the acts of another, even if you're not necessarily fully aware of what's going on, as long as it's in furtherance of this criminal enterprise that they've labeled you as such. So typically when the feds come after you, got to realize the feds, they have a 90-something conviction rate merely because by the time they bring charges, they're so thorough in their work. And you got to remember the federal government has access to everything that you have access to and more. So if you really want to check in on you, you're bound to slip up somewhere. You don't know that you're slipping up, and they'll compile all that evidence and then bring it to your doorstep and say, here's why we're arresting you. So by the time the feds come, they're not doing an active investigation. They've concluded their investigation, and they're going to go ahead and turn that over to the DA. Now with YSL, theirs is a state case, which is different because they're relying on the apparatus of the state, which is infinitely smaller than what the federal government has access to. So, and the federal government specializes in RICO charges. This is something that they themselves put together. So it only makes sense that the federal government will have a higher conviction rate than a state government that might not specialize in the RICO. So with the YSL RICO, it could almost go any way, and it seems like maybe it's all the media presence, or it just seems like it's becoming something else at this point. I don't know what it is, but it's becoming something else, and at this point, like I said, it could go either way. So that's the minute 30 YSL analysis.
Okay. All right, let's see. Let's you want me to go ahead and pull up your night? I'm sure we'll get to this, but Jonathan in the chat room's already saying that Nigeria will have a revolution soon.
Well, we will get to that.
Okay, let me go ahead and pull up the presentation, and there we go. Bam. Okay, let me see if I could just view only. No, how do I do it? Here we go. View, is it slideshow? There we go. Okay, then down up. All right, there we go. Perfect. All right, go ahead.
All right, so let's go ahead and get right into it. All right, so we're going to be talking about Nigeria and the military. So regarding Nigeria and the military, one thing we have to remember is anything that has happened before has the capacity and the potential to happen once more. So it's no secret in Nigeria that Nigeria has vacillated between civilian rule and military rule, and oftentimes with the same results. If we really look at it now, it might be a different flavor, but it's still the same dish. In fact, we've actually had presidents who were military heads of states and then later became civilian heads of states. We actually had quite a few. We've had OBJ, Obasanjo. We also had Muhammadu Buhari, who here, who were military strongmen, military heads of state, who, you know, were there as military men in uniform, and later they put on Agbada and became civilian. Now, some people said the only thing that changed was their outfit, but that is endemic of what we see throughout Nigeria. It's not necessarily the leadership style. It's more so the cohesive ideology that binds us as a nation that we're all collectively working towards, and thought, speech, and action, and not just professing. It's so a wise man once told me that you know what somebody believes by what they do, not what they profess. So you can tell me all the time about how you're a great person, you treat people well, but then every time I mean, your president that tells me what you really believe in rather than what you profess to believe in. So you always look at someone's actions before coming to the conclusion as to who and what they really are. Let's go to the next slide.
Yes, sir.
Now, one of the very important indicators for Nigerians generally is how much does their naira buy them? And if we just look at the trend of just over the last 21 years, the amount of dollars necessary to create 1 million naira or convert to 1 million naira has steadily reduced, almost uncontrollably. So the most important metric that Nigerians use is how much can my naira get me? And as time has moved on in this long period of Nigeria being a democratic dispensation, we see that things have kind of rapidly started moving in the other direction. And so there needs to be radical change to checkmate the radical de-evolution and the radical downgrading that we're in the nation experiencing. Let's go to the next one. So now when we talk about Africa, we have to talk about inter-African competitiveness. When we talk about African nations, we have to ask the question, how competitive are you inside of Africa? Right? So let's take a slice of 10 years and we'll look at the top 5 economies of Africa. Now, some of these nations, so in 2014, Nigeria was almost a $600 billion economy, which was almost competing with certain nations in Europe. South Africa in 2014 was just under 400 billion. Egypt, always a top 5 contender, just over 321 billion. Algeria, 239 billion, and Angola, with their recent oil wealth, 145, almost 150 billion, just 3.3 short of 150. Now, let's fast forward almost 10 years into the future. Now we see that Egypt really kind of stayed the same and went from 320 to about 390, almost 400 billion, which is a good progress, a good progression. South Africa went from almost the same spot, but it really regressed. Its economy contracted. It went from 380 to 377. So it kind of stagnated. Not bad though. it's still holding firm. That means the economy is very stable. It doesn't fluctuate up too much, doesn't fluctuate down too much. Stability on the African continent is actually a good thing. When you look at Nigeria, Nigeria had a retraction of almost $200 billion. Nigeria lost almost the entire economy of Algeria in 10 years, going from 2014 to 2023. And it's important to remember these dates because we can see certain things. Now, 2024, the estimate, we're still finishing up, rounding up, but South Africa basically stayed in the same position, went from 377 billion to 373 billion. Once again, South Africa is a stable bet, right? You look at Egypt. Egypt went from 390 to back to 340, a little bit above where they were in 2014, but not quite where they were in 2023. Then we look at Algeria. Algeria kind of stayed stable from the 240s to the 250s and kind of in the 260s. Now, Nigeria here is the big shocker because if you look at 2014, you had a nation that was inching towards 600 billion is now at $250 million. And then you look at Ethiopia, which has made some good gains from 160 to 200. So let's go ahead and go to the next one. All right, now we have to take into account and remember those numbers that we discussed earlier. So now when we look at who was president, we look at Obasanjo's economic growth, honestly, was, and remember, he was a military head of state. He's actually, I would say, of course, nobody's perfect and everyone has their flaws, but I would definitely venture to say that Obasanjo's economic team was superb. The people that he introduced into government were actual technocrats. He actually put the proper people in place for the proper results. And you have to remember that he was a military man as well as a civilian president. So we've actually experienced having someone as a military man who was just okay as a military head of state. He was a stabilizing force. So now as a civilian, arguably and statistically being one of the best civilian administrators the nation has ever had, if we're just going by the numbers. Now, on the basis or the foundation that Obasanjo built, we had Umaru Yar'Adua. Of course, his family was also closely linked to the military, and he had a lot of military ties. But he was a civilian president, and he did good. He stabilized and built on the great foundation that Obasanjo provided. Now, in 2010, Goodluck Jonathan came in and things really took up from there. Things were looking amazing. Goodluck had a lot of Obasanjo's economic team in there. He integrated a lot of the positives from Obasanjo's government. He kept the good, and governance was moving, even though there were a few blips here and there. But overall, Nigeria was still moving in a very, very good direction. Now, if you look at President Muhammadu Buhari, who just left office, he was similar to Obasanjo. He was a military man who was also a civilian president. So now if we look at it, this is the first time where we see Nigeria going completely the other way, literally going backwards, and then struggling to get out of that hole. So if you go back 5%, and then you go up 1%, and then you go up 1% again, you might have 2 consecutive years of growth, but you're still at -3 from where you started. So even if you just get back to where you started, it's almost as if other nations were moving forward while you're stagnating the nation. So we see that Muhammadu Buhari, a lot of his economic policies, when he was a military head of state, he enacted those many very similar policies when he was a civilian president. So it goes back to, is it form or is it substance? Let's go to the next slide. And this just gives an overall view of their overall performance. So you can see during Obasanjo, you had an 81%, Yar'Adua 26%, Goodluck 26%, And then Muhammadu Buhari, a 1.4% increase, which is, I don't need everybody to be a mathematician to understand that there's a large difference between 81% and 1.4%. Let's go to the next slide. And the reason African nations have to be extremely serious is because, remember I talked about there's inter-African competition, meaning that there's the competition between African nations, right? So among the top 5 in Africa, it's like, yeah, you know, these nations are fighting to be the top in Africa, but then Africa, you got to realize that it's not in a bubble. So for every dollar you're stealing, if you're in government and you're misappropriating funds in an African nation, you're doing yourself a double disservice because your economies. So, for example, you look at some of the largest economies in the EU in Europe. You look at Germany. Germany is what, 4.2 thousand billion or 4.2 trillion, and in Nigeria at a high point was almost $500 million, which is, that's good, but that's what, 8 times smaller. So any contraction from that, and you have to remember, these are your mates, these are your competitors, these are your peers. So it's not enough to be number 1 in Africa. You have to have a global outlook because you have to be globally competitive. Let's go to the next slide.
Real quick, guys, please hit that like button. Again, please hit that like button as you come to the chat room. If you have not hit the like button, hit the like button. And around when Ebube wraps up, we'll also put the link in the chat room so you guys can call in. I'll go ahead, Ebube.
All right. So anybody who hasn't been living under a rock knows that there was a hotly contested election in Nigeria. I mean, I have to remember that, of course, elections have consequences. And one thing we have to start imbibing in ourselves as African people is that you have to seek competence above everything else, above any other consideration, because many of the nations haven't reached their full potential and in fact are grappling and dealing with very serious issues that only serious competent people can actually deal with. So let's go ahead and go to the next one. So what we see here is that the president of Nigeria, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, won, and these are the results that were put out by the government. Now, Nigeria has a population of almost 230 million people.
Yeah, but not to interject, sorry to interrupt, but I'm looking at these numbers. Are you telling me that roughly, we'll say 25 million people voted, which is rounded up out of 200 million people?
And what's even more crazy is that the president, according to the results released by the government, won by less than, 7% approval. So now if we look at the people who voted out of the entire population, of course that's not the voting population is a lot smaller, but to only get 8 million yeses, if you will, there are more people who didn't want the current president to be president than people who wanted the current president to be president. If we look at the PDP and LP, which were very close because the front runner of the LP was at one point in the PDP, was in the PDP for quite some time. If had the LP and the PDP potentially reached some sort of agreement, they would be around 12.8. And then if they would have worked something out with NPP, that would have put them at 14. So about 14 million people voted for the president to not be president versus 8.7 million people out of a nation of 230. So it raises serious questions as to who's really participating in the political process for these numbers to be this low. And then that brings up another question. Are these numbers genuine? Because anything and everything can happen in a nation like Nigeria, but we'll just take these as the numbers. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So yeah, so this is just a breakdown, and if we look at it by number of states, Tinubu, according to the number of votes, he won 12 states. Peter Obi won 12 states, 11 in the FCT, and then Atiku won 12 states. So Nigeria was this vote, this election. Some say this was the most divided vote because there's really no real clear majority here. Any one of these guys, depending on if there were recounts or how they did it, almost any one of these guys, except Kwankwaso, based on the official results, could have easily been the president. So let's go to the next one. So even though any one of those guys could have been the president is Bola Ahmed Tinubu. Now, Bola Ahmed Tinubu has been in office, and the thing about once you get in office is this. People don't care what you say anymore. People only care what you say during campaign. Now, the good thing about a campaign is you don't have to prove anything you say. You can just say whatever you want. You can say, if I was president, then there would be 24/7 electricity. If I was president, there would be no insecurity. If I was president, there would be a 30% jump in employment. And you don't really have to back anything up. You can just say things, you can just say that you're competent and capable without having to prove anything. However, once you win an election, at that point, you now have to perform. Let's go to the next one. The issue now is that a lot of people are starting to say, okay, so what's the plan? Initially, it was an interesting campaign because some people were here's my plan, here are the basics, let's break it down. And other people were saying, listen, we're not going to eat statistics, and they didn't really get much into strategy. And so now is the time people are saying, okay, what's the economic blueprint? What's the plan? And there are people who are on social media, of course. Nigerians are very vocal on social media. They'll go to social media. They'll really let you know what's on their minds because you have so many people with access to the internet over there, just in their handset. And Nigerians have been able to do a lot with the internet. We'll get into that later. Let's go to the next one. So now, in line with Nigerians being on social media, you have Dele Parorotimi. He basically stated that as much as I might hate the truth, I'm obliged to follow it whatever it leads. Nigeria will disintegrate in the absence of justice, and there can be no justice without a radical restructuring of the entire governance systems, which is plural, he said systems. And that's merely a first step and not itself the end. So certain political analysts in Nigeria are already coming to the conclusion that justice means you do the right thing by all people. Justice means that when you're given money to build a hospital, you build a hospital, not a mansion, and buy property in Dubai and all over the world and just use that money to enjoy yourself, because you're not doing justice by the people, you're not doing right by the people. And when there's enough people not doing right by the people look to replace the system. Now, currently the system in Nigeria is a democratic governance system. People have accepted that. People are saying, this is our system, we'll follow it. Now, once people become so disillusioned with the system, then they look to replace the system. And in replacing the system, it can be anything. That's the danger over having a spontaneous revolution, if you will. You don't quite know what's on the other side. You know what the people want in the immediacy, but the real question is the aftermath. But let's go to the next one. So it's with that in mind that we analyze the first 14 months of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's government. So let's go ahead and go to the next one. Let's take a look at inside the government. Now, whenever you look inside something, you got to look at the composition. Now, the composition of the government, people often talk about age in Nigeria, and we need younger people. Most of his government is under the age of 50 years old. We also have a lot of female representation. So there's male and there's female. And the people above 50 are very few in number, actually. So we have people from all across the demographic. Now, in regards to the ministerial cabinet, and what a minister does, for anybody not familiar with that term, is that the president has certain enumerated powers, and he can delegate those powers to people because the president isn't going to be able to do everything. So, for example, the president is in charge of aviation, but the president is also in charge of foreign affairs and also in charge of the works and also in charge of electricity. No one person is able to sufficiently handle all of that and still handle the external needs of the nation and making deals and the economy. And there's just so much. So what the president does is the president picks somebody, and every state has to have at least one minister. So you have to have a minister from every state. So you might give minister for power to Kebbi, minister of works to Abia, minister of foreign affairs to Oyo, and then you just dole them out like that. It's an interesting system. It means that all states will at least have one person in governance. So it's to an extent fair. Some regions will get more depending on just how the roll of the dice goes. So in the Northwest, for example, there are 9 ministers. In the Southwest, the least is the Southeast. And the interesting thing about Tinubu's government is that he has people from different political parties who are his ministers, which is an interesting thing. It hasn't really happened like that, where the FCT minister is purportedly still a PDP member. Some people might say that's no longer the truth, but let's go to the next slide. So now we can see the distribution of the different geopolitical zones. Once again, most of the ministers in this government that are handling this government are Northwest and Southwest, about 18 between the two. And there are PDP members in this government and other members from various governments, actually. It's a very, on paper, very inclusive government. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. Now, I brought up age a minute ago, and we have to take a look at the median age of the top 5 economies in Africa and Europe. We always have to juxtapose Africa to Europe. So we see in a nation like Italy, the average age is almost 50 years old, which is crazy, because you need young people, because you have to look at humans and human capital almost like a commodity. And the younger the human, the more work you're going to get out of that human, theoretically. And the older the human, the less productive that human is going to be, theoretically. So if most of the median age of the people in your nation is almost 50 years old, you might start seeing that you have some problems for the future. However, a lot of African nations are blessed to not have that problem. So if you look at Nigeria, for example, the median age in Nigeria is 17 years old. So the median age Nigerian has a long, if Nigeria gets the system right, there's a long amount of productive years ahead of the average Nigerian, which should be a good thing if that average Nigerian is able to be put inside of a conducive system that would allow for them to be as constructive and productive as they actually need to be. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So now what we also see is the average age of the ministers in the top 5 economies. So we look at Nigeria, who had an average age of 17 years old. The average person in government, in the executive, is 62 years old. That's kind of crazy when you think about it. In Egypt, for example, they had an age of 24 at 60. South Africa, the age is 27, 62. So it's interesting that the young people are still not taking their position in the nation, being that they make up such a vast majority, a heavily skewed majority. And if the youth isn't dealt with in a certain way, it leads to the youth reacting, and almost like a bubbling pot that you try to cover. You can only cover it for so long before the pressure builds up, and they say pressure busts pipes. Let's go ahead and look at Nigeria's military under Tinubu. Let's go to the next one. All right, so now in regards to looking at the budget, we see that there are some serious issues with this budget. First off, we see that there's a deficit, partially because of the devaluation of the Naira, But really, the real problem, you see the inputs and then you see the outputs. The real problem is you got 8.56 trillion naira, which is debt servicing, which means that, and it's not bad for a nation to initially take loans. Because let's say you need to build an electrical infrastructure system across your nation. Now, that's okay. It's going to take a lot of money up front, but it'll pay itself off because it's an electrical grid. You need electricity to be productive so that you can get your manufacturing sector going, so that you can go from consumption to production. And things start growing from there once you get production and manufacturing under your belt. The problem is when that money comes in, it's not spent where it's supposed to be spent, but the money is still owed. And that goes back to there not being a unified ideology in the country to say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make, we still have to ask ourselves as Nigerians, why are we as a nation of Nigeria? What is our goal? What is our end goal that we're looking for? What do we want as a nation? Because if we actually had an articulated position, you wouldn't have situations where people, instead of building an electrical grid that's supposed to be the basis and the backbone of the manufacturing industry, are buying homes in Dubai with it. Let's go to the next one. You see here, we see certain key, we see the inflation rate, May 2023. It was 22.41%. Now, 33.4. You see the foreign exchange rate. May 2023 was almost 1 to 500. Now it's 1 to 1,600. You see the foreign reserve. That actually went up. Let's go to the next one. All right, so now we're taking a look at the price of gasoline. So you see that the price in May 2023 was almost just a little over 230. Now you got 780. We're going to talk about the price of gasoline because a lot of Nigeria's economy is based on movement of goods and people and using different types of alternative forms of electricity through electricity generation, through in-home electricity generation. Let's go to the next one. So now there was a big issue with fuel subsidy. Fuel subsidy really created a lot of issues, And so, Don, let's go to the next one.
Oh, my bad.
So I'll go to brother. And so with that, what happened is that there was a situation whereby Nigeria was subsidizing the fuel that people used. It was a very shady operation, according to people who analyzed it and discussed it. There was a lot of unfortunate things that were happening with money, allegedly. Let's go to the next one. Now, after the fuel subsidy was removed, things just became more expensive naturally. Transportation costs went up, everything went up, inflation went up, and then the value of the naira went down. So it's really almost like these things went up further than what they are because the number and purchasing power of the naira that was in your hand 1 year is substantially less than the power in purchasing that it can get merely 12 months later by the mere fact that the government and their systems, to an extent, failed the people to ensure that gross inflation wouldn't happen. Let's go to the next one. Here we just have a visualization of where things were and where they moved to. And everything went up. Every necessity that the average person would need, from rice, chicken, beans, eggs, curry, pepper, tomatoes, indomie, palm oil, and groundnut oil, they all went up substantially. Nothing went down, and the naira actually was devalued. So these are actually, in real life, the real effect is a lot higher. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So this is just breaking it down the other way so that you can see the red line being put over top of the white line. You just kind of see that that red line stands for suffering, right? So that's the amount of suffering that Nigerians are going through currently under this administration. However, the administration has stated that there's going to be suffering so that things can get better. So if we're going to listen to the government, hopefully that's a true statement, because if it's not, then putting people through unnecessary suffering without a true plan to quell and stop that suffering is a recipe for disaster. Let's go to the next one. We're going to analyze another potential key piece of the economy, which is Nigeria could legitimately be a steel producing powerhouse. Nigeria's actual production in tons compared to its potential. If you look at all the green lines are the potential. The purple lines are where we're actually at. And if you look at the potentials, if you look at the potential of the Delta Steel Company and Ajay Akuta, if you look at those two, even if they were going at half of their potential, Nigeria would be a very competitive in the steel market. And when you're building a nation, in order to build those nice tall skyscrapers and all those things, you need steel. You need cheap, readily available steel. And Nigeria has all the natural resources to have steel. And then Nigeria could eventually export steel if, once again, if we had an articulated vision as to where we want to go. Whether or not it's under a military government, whether or not it's under a civilian government. We saw that we've had presidents under military dispensations and presidents under civilian dispensations. Some proved better as a civilian, and some proved very predictable, very flatlining as a civilian president. I'll let you come to the conclusion as to which one. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the amount of money necessary to fill up your car, certain Nigerians have actually and if you ever been to Nigeria, you understand how much you're either inside of a danfo, shout outs to danfo, whether you're inside of a danfo, you're on keke, you're on Moluwe, you're on Inaga, anything that you're riding like that, or you have your own personal car, or you have a driver and you have one of these big Jeeps that we so love in Nigeria. You need a car to move around Nigeria, or you need to be in some sort of a car. Very few people get around with bicycles. There are very few bicycle lanes.
Hey, Ebube, your sound kind of got distorted.
Okay. There's very few bicycle lanes in Nigeria. So whatever you get into is going to be some sort of a petrol-fueled car. So let's go, or vehicle. So let's go to the next one. Furthermore, under this current
Ebube, your sound, your volume is distorted again. I don't know. It's
what about now? How's it sound?
It's muffled.
Okay. What about now?
A little bit better.
Okay.
Go ahead. Say it again.
1 second. Let me see if I can take care of that.
You're fine now.
Perfect. Let's go ahead and get into it. So now there's been.
Ebube, we lost you. Ebube, we lost you.
Hey, guys, can you hear
me? You're back now, but you're back muffled.
But am I back to being normal? One second, guys. Let me change something over here on the settings.
Okay. Guys, do me a favor. Hit the like button again. Please hit that like button. Also, make sure you share and make sure you subscribe as well. Please like, share, and subscribe.
Hey, Don, it's how we sounding.
You sound good.
Perfect. Volume good, everything?
Yeah, you're good to go.
All right, let's keep pushing. So now everyone knows about Japa and basically looking for greater pastures. Now, some of the people queried or questioned through a survey discussed that unstable economic policies, insecurity, better opportunities, things actually working in regards to the system abroad. Many nations have a unified ideology as to what they want to do and why they're a nation. So things work because everybody's working for that. Now, corruption is everywhere. However, endemic, direct, vertical, and horizontal corruption, anytime you have those present in high quantities, that nation simply isn't going to work. Let's go ahead and go to the next one.
Oh, we lost him. Ebube fell off. Guys, do me a favor, hit the like button and please hit that like button. Also, make sure you share and make sure you subscribe. Everyone, thank you so much for joining. Let's get Ebube back on. Let me message him, let him know that he fell off. No, he's back. Oh, you're back.
All right. Seems like StreamYards is playing a little bit of games with this, but can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Perfect, perfect. So one thing I wanted to discuss is the potential tourism potentials in Nigeria. Nigeria is totally underutilized when it comes to tourism. Nigeria sits in the tropics. Nigeria sits along the Atlantic Ocean. Nigeria has some very beautiful beaches.
Ebube, if I could interject, sorry for interrupting you.
Yes, sir.
Why do you think it's under, like, Nigeria is beautiful, freaking beautiful? What's the issue when it comes
Well,
to
here's
tourism?
the issue is that when you have people who can merely rely on a mono economy like oil, that'll give them billions and billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars, that they could just easily just move from one account to another. It doesn't really give them the incentive to be creative and seek other ways to create a real economy, because Nigeria's economy can multiply tenfold if all of these small sectors that are readily available and apparent are taken advantage of and exploited. So some people call it a resource curse, where you have so much of one resource that, hey, as long as we got this, we can legitimately survive off of one resource, and we can still line our pockets with this resource without having to actually do any additional work. So we don't have to be competent. We just have to be rugged enough to take political office. So whenever you have that situation occur, there's going to be things that could naturally lead to even more money than the oil, but the short-sightedness of the people who are able to bogart their way into positions of power won't allow them to look past the seeds that they want to eat versus the trees that they could be planting.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So, for example, if you look at Croatia, Croatia makes $13.5 billion every year, which is almost 20% of its GDP. You look at the Maldives, almost 70% of their GDP is tourism alone. You look at Seychelles, 23%. Other nations, extremely high. And Nigeria has all the potentials of what Croatia has or more. If Nigeria really needed to fill a debt deficit, they could easily take care of that through farming or tourism or any one of the multiple, or even production if the Nigerian government decides to be serious about electricity generation. Let's go to the next slide.
Real quick, Ebube. So somebody brought up the reason why tourism is struggling is because of Boko Haram. And then
Boko Haram isn't along. They're not at the beachfront.
right, but then my argument would be, well, explain Mexico with all the cartel issues going on.
The thing is, in Mexico, you have a government that actually makes sure that tourism is going to be a moneymaker. So regardless, whenever a nation decides to be serious about whatever it wants to be serious about, it's going to accomplish it. Now, whenever it wants to rely on a convenient excuse, that convenient excuse will in fact be enough.
Okay. Makes sense. All right, next slide. You said go to the next slide?
Yes, sir. All right, one thing we have to remember is Nigeria's informal sector. Right, Nigeria's informal sector hires almost everyone that's not working in government or for a structured organization. So the informal employment has gone down, which means that more and more Nigerians are entering the formal employment. Hey, Dennis.
Yeah, I'm here. You had kind of went out, but I'm here.
Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the next one.
Jonathan says Boko Haram has nothing to do with the tourism problem. Guys, look, when I invite people to come to Nigeria, oh man, it's like pulling teeth out of a lion sometimes with a steak suit on. They bring up Boko Haram, they bring up Boko Haram, they bring up Boko Haram. So
Well, that's also a perception issue. Tourism is also a perception issue. If your nation is perceived to be unsafe, it's tourism is like real estate.
Ebube, you went out.
Yeah, tourism is like real estate. If you're trying to sell somebody a neighborhood, a house in the neighborhood, and they say, well, there was a shooting here 2 weeks ago. It's the same thing as that, right? It doesn't mean that the neighborhood is necessarily always dangerous, but it does mean that there's a perception issue.
We're going to the next slide, or are we right here?
Yes, sir. Let's go to the next one.
Okay. Are we there?
All right. So now within the informal section, what we have to remember is that most Nigerians are employed in the informal section. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. Hey, Dennis, on my end, it doesn't look like it's changing. Is it changing on your end?
Yeah, it's changed. Yeah, I changed it.
What are you seeing currently?
Say that again.
What are you seeing currently?
234 Intel. It has Tinubu's 1 year in office economy.
Perfect. All right, let's go straight into that then. So now, if we look at the inflation rate, you had 22%, almost to 34%. Public debt, of course, went up. Foreign reserves went down slightly. The exchange rate is one of the biggest losers, just based on where we were looking at it. The Naira exchange rate is it's really not where it needs to be. The money supply, at one point it was 56 trillion. Now we're looking at, 92 trillion. Interest rates, 18% to 28%. Food inflation, 24% to 40%. Let's go and go to the next one.
Guys, is the slides changing on your end? Because on my end, it's changing. Is it changing on your guys' end? Because Seven said, search for Huru Dynasty. We can't see it. Are you guys? Can you see the current slide? It says Tinubu's 1 year in office labor. Can you guys see that? Somebody says no. That's weird. Okay, so what do you guys see?
It's the tourism. Still about tourism.
Something about tourism.
Yes, sir. I would say just take it down and restart the slide.
Yeah, hold on. Let me yeah, that's weird. Hold on 1 second. Let me no, let's do this. Stop the screen. Let me do it again. Share screen. All right. So what do you guys see now? This said
perfect. Yes, we got it perfect.
Okay.
All right. So in regards to just it seems like everything that's worth it is going in the other direction. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide.
All right, I should say labor now. Does it say labor?
Yep, we're looking good. So let me take a look at this. We also see transportation by road, petrol, electricity, everything, air travel doubled. How much it costs to eat a healthy diet has doubled. And these are the indicators that are actually real to people. So after the campaigns are over, and now after you get into it, you can't say, well, the PDP this or PDP that. You can't even say the former president, because the two of you guys were kind of a pair. It was supposed to be a 1-2 punch, and it kind of went the other way. So this is the point where these are the metrics that the people actually care about. How much does it cost to have a healthy diet? How much does it cost to be able to drive to work? There's certain people that their entire salary would be spent on transportation and rent. So they're basically working to be able to live where they live and very little else, which means that once you create a situation where all your necessities triple, it's like tripling somebody's rent, tripling the price to fill up your tank, and then you double the price of food. You've created a situation where something is going to have to change, and that's just the reality of it. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. We also have to look at the impact of tech startups on Nigeria's economy. Nigeria, remember, we talked about the fact that Nigeria has a high internet penetration. So you got a lot of people using the internet in Nigeria. So one of the things that people are using, about 1/3 of the industry, is based on payments and remittances. Because a lot of people, a lot of Nigerian Americans, the whole point Nigerians come to America is because America just has an amazing economy. And if you're able to get access to this economy, this great economy that America has, a lot of Nigerians turn around and invest back in Nigeria. They send a lot of money home, a lot of money. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So in line with that, lending, financing, invest tech, payments and remittances, all those are at the top. Now, we've seen that there's been a slowdown. The major growth period for tech startups was 2019 to 2021. 2022, 2023, and into the present era, it's faltered a little bit. It's not as if the boom is over, because the boom can continue, because tech is always the future by just sheer definition of what it is and how it operates and its proliferation. But tech will continue to be a driving sector of the economy, and tech startups are and could potentially, if harnessed right, is one of the things like tourism that's just merely underutilized. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So ICT, information communication technology, basically what we call IT here, contributed to in 2022 as much as 20% to Nigeria's GDP in the third quarter. So that just shows you the potentials. And when people ask about why certain things aren't being exploited, it's almost like it's a no-brainer. This is what we should be focusing on. Government should be serious about these things. That's just the long and short of it. These are things we need to hold government responsible for, and say, why aren't we exploiting this? Why aren't we exploiting that? Let's go ahead and go to the next one. Now, Nigeria's net migration is actually going down, surprisingly. Some people say everybody who wanted to leave or could leave has already left, but it's just some Nigerians are just saying, hey, look, we're going to get through it. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. All right, an important factor and something we discussed, one of the reasons that the tech industry is so strong is because people use technology to send money to Africa. And this is what every immigrant does. So when you look at the German immigrant, typically German immigrants send about $2.8 billion back to Germany. So German immigrants, they come here, they work, and they send money back to their homeland. Nothing like what the Mexicans do, though. The Mexicans, they send almost 10 times what the German immigrants send to their home country. Like $30 billion is getting pumped into America into Mexico from the American economy. Guatemala, 7.7 billion. El Salvador, almost 5 billion. Honduras, 3.7 billion. The Dominican, almost 4.6. But excuse me. But Nigeria, it's $6.2 billion every single year that the Diaspora. So what a lot of Nigerians come here is they say, hey, look, the American economy is unmatched. It's untouchable. I need to get into America, because America, if you work hard, America will reward you, especially if you can create a lane for yourself or create a system or find a business to get into. And you work hard in that direction, you can actually make a lot of progress in America in a very short time. That's the beautiful thing about this country. So a lot of Nigerians come and they send money to Nigeria. They're essentially the driving investment force. Eventually, what's going to happen is the future power brokers and people who really own Nigeria are going to be the children of the Diaspora, because the children of the Diaspora have a consistent economy that they're attached to, and they still have an affinity for the country that they came from. So they open businesses in Nigeria, they build houses, they build rental properties, they develop beachfronts because they take ideas that they saw from the Western nations and say, oh, okay, here's an economic avenue to exploit that has never been exploited before. Let me go ahead and get some beachfront resorts going. Dinesh, you know, for a long time, you've been going to Nigeria a long time. Beachfront resorts are really just aren't a thing. I mean, there are a few here and there, but for a coastline, as long as Nigeria is on such a beautiful.
yeah, you got a great point there. They're really not. I mean, well, I take that back. Is yes and no, because of course you have Landmark.
Yeah, but I'm talking about in regards to the what should be there versus what's there now.
You got a point, but at the same time, I think a lot of the land that, in fact, here we go, Ebube, who owns the beachfront? It's the
Well,
government. We
well,
just got that out with Landmark.
well, it depends because there's certain waterways that the federal government controls, and then there's certain waterways that the state government controls. But I think the federal government's claim predominates most of the state's claims. But I think the federal government, I believe. But then there are some waterways that the state governments control. But at the end of the day, and there was also a waterways bill that they tried to pass a few years ago to put all the waterways under the federal government. I'm not quite sure if that passed because I remember it was a very contentious bill. But anyway, so those are the types of things that the Diaspora remittances, which also ties into the ICT industry because they're using apps to make these transactions, to the tune of $6.1 billion, which is a lot annually. Let's go ahead and go to the next one.
But also too, once that Lagos Calabar Highway is done, I think they're gonna, just with that being completed, I think more resorts will come.
That is the goal. But you said with that being completed, so let's wait for them to complete it, and then once it's completed, it's there. It exists it's not just in the ether. It's actually on ground. That will do a lot to spur development.
Well, listen, they're developing it because the hotel I stay at in Lagos is right at the beginning of the highway, and there's road and shit. They're doing work. They're working on it.
I want to see them finish it. I really want to because that's going to have amazing economic potentials if you have a coastal highway. Because at that point, you can just develop right off that highway and put a resort literally right off of the highway, and 90% of the infrastructural work is done. All you need to do is make sure that there's running water, which you can get maybe some boreholes, and then just make sure the power lines run, and you're all set. The road is always the most difficult thing. So those are the things I like to see get done first, because those are going to spur economic development, because anywhere you build a road in Nigeria, people will develop off of that road. So I'm hoping that they do it and finish it, and they do it in a good job and in a quick and sufficient manner. So, because that road has high economic potentials once they finish it. And I think they will finish it. My only concern is the speed at which they'll finish it. So earlier we talked about the $6.19 billion that goes into Nigeria from the Diaspora. Most of it goes to Lagos, 3.6 billion of it. The other part goes to Abuja, 1.6 billion. Obviously, those are the places where Nigerians in diaspora are going to feel most comfortable investing, because those places have the highest number of expats, the highest number of people who live abroad but visit Nigeria. They go to Lagos, they go to Abuja, they might go to their village, but typically one of those two places are the international gateways for Nigeria. Now, the two honorable mentions are Akwa Ibom and Anambra. Anambra gets almost 37 million annually, and Akwa Ibom gets about 42.5 annually from the Diaspora. So a lot of money. The top 4 destinations for Diaspora money are Lagos, Abuja, Akwa Ibom, and Anambra State. Everywhere else is a lot lower, but it makes sense why those 4 would probably be the big 4. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So under Tinubu, we have to analyze the movie industry. Now there are billion naira grossing films. There are movies that have went into the hundreds of millions of naira within the last 4, 5, 6 years. The movie industry is actually one of the things that government should actually dump money into this industry, because this industry started independent of government and was able to move forward in a way that's actually become a robust industry without the assistance of government, if you will. So imagine if the government poured billions of naira into the movie industry to create cinema villages and things of that nature, where we could even quadruple output. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So So Nigeria has had a consistent release of movies annually, thousands of movies that vacillate between 2.6 to 2.7, 2,600 to 2,700. And the movie industry is profitable. It's one of the most profitable in the world, actually, in regards to the cost to make versus the cost that comes back or the profits made at market. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. And let's take a look at this on a monthly scale. Now, on a monthly scale, typically Nigeria averages around 200 movies, just a little over 200 movies every single month, which is almost 50 a week, which is almost 8 a day, which is pretty impressive. 8 movies a day are being released in Nigeria. That's why there's nobody here that watches Nigerian cinema that can name every movie released in a week. Talk less of a month. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. Another major contributor to the economy under the government of Bola Ahmed Tinubu is the music industry, streaming. Nigeria, similar. There was a time when the movie industry outpaced the music industry, but now the music industry is actually outpacing the movie industry. Nigerian music is enjoyed as a commodity worldwide. Not just, I remember there was a time when you had to go to certain places in America to hear Afrobeat back in 2011, 2009, 2010. It would be amazing if you went to a venue and they played D'banj and Mohits and Why Me and Tongolo and all those type of songs, Plantation Boys, all those guys from back in the days, One Day Coles. But now today, you walk in a mall or in Target, you might hear Afrobeat, which is amazing. So once again, this is another industry that was more organic without government support, but the government, I would say, should put money into this and make sure that any product that comes out of Nigeria, first, that the money has to go into the hands of a Nigerian. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. Another pillar in the economy is Dangote. Everybody knows Dangote. Very little needs to be said. Billionaire many times over. He's in almost every business. He's also building a refinery. That's not news either, and it's basically built, and they're getting to putting the final touches on it. So it's going to have an effect on the economy.
He had lost his #1 spot as the richest African, but he just regained it, I think, last week or earlier. He regained
I never really believed those numbers, because at the end of the day, if I'm worth $100 billion and you say I'm worth $7 billion, that's okay for me. I don't need you to know about the other 93 billion. I will accept the 7 and we will keep it pushing, because at that point, the only difference between you knowing I have 7 billion and 93 billion is that I'm a bigger target at 100 billion versus when you only thought I had 7 billion. So I sincerely doubt, and let's go to the next slide, but I sincerely doubt that these guys are genuinely wanting their true net worth to be known. It's almost like someone knowing exactly what's in your bank account. You really don't want that. Just know that I got it, and that's it if you want to know. So the Dangote refinery is supposed to eliminate fuel queues. Now, fuel queues are a result of scarcity and distribution. They really shouldn't occur at all, but there are breaks in the system, if you will, where people are allegedly diverting things to certain places to feed the black market so that the formal sector isn't being fed its proper amount. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. Also, too, there's an issue as to just how much Nigerians actually consume. This is a very politicized number, because allegedly there are people who use this number or inflate this number for the sole purpose of stealing. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So the Dangote refinery is going to show the true usage. So now the Dangote has actually officially started with the production of petrol. They've actually moved forward and they're producing it. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So Forex, or the demand for Forex, will reduce by almost half just by having the products produced locally in Nigeria, which will be a great thing. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. Another problem that we have in Nigeria is that sometimes the refined stuff that we buy from abroad is what they would colloquially term as rubbish. So it'll mess up your car. Your car will have all sorts of problems that it's not supposed to have because the allegedly refined gasoline is just so impure that it's destroying your engine. So a lot of Nigerians like these really nice cars, and then they buy them and they fill up their gas, and their cars start having these problems that they shouldn't have. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So, according to what they're moving on about, the quality that Dangote is going to produce is going to be at the level that's sufficient to be purchased by the United States and China and Russia and all these other places, which means it's going to be an international standard. And so I hope that they don't look to cut corners when it comes to supplying their own country. And hopefully they supply the same thing that they supply to Europeans. All right, so let's go to the next one. Now, a shocking event, and remember, I told you all nations are connected. So they look at what happened in another nation and they know that these things could potentially happen to them. So if you don't know, and there is the Bangladesh Prime Minister, Hasina. She resigned because there was this strange quota system that they had for the children of the soldiers of the revolution, if you will, where they would basically be preferred and they were almost getting turned into a permanent upper class that was just going to be perpetuated into perpetuity. And it was basically creating the haves and have-nots. And so the people, the youth who had similar dynamics to many of the African nations, if you look at the numbers, Bangladesh was very similar to almost the average African country in regards to employment, inflation, some of the numbers I went over earlier. And so a lot of African leaders took note when Bangladesh's prime minister left the nation. They said, wait a minute, all the factors that were present there are somewhat present here. So it really shook things up a little bit. And then you had the End Bad Governance protests happening around a similar time as when this was going on. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. Now, a lot of the End Bad Governance protest was done by the north of the country. And as noted here by Mr. Farotimi, he stated that the Nigerian revolution will start in northern Nigeria. Now, if you know anything about the End Bad Governance, it was really a lot of northern youths. You didn't really have a lot of people in the east. There were some places in the west, but most of the protests and things of that nature were done by the north because the southern part of Nigeria economically is the quality of life is higher. The key indices of life and things that need to be present, healthcare, lower rates of poverty, higher rates of literacy. The North has a lot of negative stats that the South simply doesn't have to deal with. So when things are bad in the South, it means things are worse in the North. And the north of the country, according to the census figures, some argue that these census figures aren't reliable, but the north actually is the majority of Nigeria. So if things are bad in the north, things are bad for the majority of Nigerians. And so some people state that any revolution that's really going to be effective always will start and stop in the north. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. And we'll take a look at that from a historical perspective because most of the successful coups in Nigeria were done by northern elements. So when the North gets upset and the North has a history of being able to remove governments via the military, you have to take it seriously because politics and governance in northern Nigeria is something that's taken very seriously. The ability to exert influence over politics is something that the North has always been able to do, whether it's in a democratic dispensation or whether it's in a military regime. So we see the coup against Iransi, the coup against Gowon, the coup against Shagari, the coup against Buhari, and the coup against Shonekan. And we see Abacha inspecting the guard. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Now, as I stated earlier regarding the protest that went on in Nigeria, you had northern youths really taking to the streets to vent their frustration. And a peculiar thing is that they were waving Russian flags. Now, if you just look at this from the surface level, a two-dimensional level, you're like, why are these people waving Russian flags? This doesn't make any sense. But you have to understand that the northern Nigerians, as simple as you may think they are, they understand geopolitics, in my personal opinion, better than anybody else. The average northerner understands geopolitics better than the average southerner. That's just a core belief that I have, and we can get into that later. But what they were really saying when they were waving those Russian flags, they weren't just waving Russian flags for no reason. What they were acknowledging is that the world is essentially divided still between America and Russia. Now, remember, America rules the world through its system. It has a military order, a monetary order, and an economic order. Those are the three pillars of the American system. And the system is just people working through thought, speech, and action to accomplish a certain goal. So anytime you have a system, it's just a bunch of people working together towards something, and they're not professing it, they're actually doing it. So now the world system is still dominated by the United States because they won the Cold War. However, Russia, and to an extent, the person who picked up Russia's pieces after the Soviet Union fell, was China. Now, China and Russia, to an extent, aren't enough to completely topple the American system. But what the Northerners in Nigeria were saying, they were saying, hey, look, the American system is messing us up. Whatever you guys are doing with the IMF and leaning towards the West and all that stuff, it's got us in a position where things aren't good for us on ground. So we need to switch teams. Let's see what Russia is offering in regards to whatever's going on in the world, because being on the team America doesn't seem to be working for us. A lot of people didn't understand the North enough to understand that that's what the Northern Nigerians were essentially saying. That's why it was taken as so much of a threat, because the current government, the Tinubu government, is very pro-Western, very pro-France, very pro-United States. To an extent, the United States in some ways has kept them at arm's length. Now, the reason might be because of some of the situations that he had stemming out of Chicago, or just generally geopolitics. We'll never truly know. But we've seen the president of Nigeria embrace France, for example, and almost go to war with the Niger Republic at the subtle behest of the French. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So this goes back to the significance of those Russian flags. It was essentially saying that Nigeria being clicked in with the West hasn't worked in Nigeria's favor. So, and you have to remember, let's go to the next one. And you have to remember that northern Nigeria is unique in that northern Nigeria really spills into southern Niger. Parts of Chad, of course, as well, but really northern Nigeria and southern Niger are essentially the same place. Some people live in northern Nigeria and work in southern Niger. It's like the DMV. Some people live in Virginia, work in Maryland or DC, vice versa. That's how the border is in Nigeria. You can just go between. You don't even need a passport. You don't need a passport to go from Nigeria. If you just do it, just drive across the road, you'll just go right into the country. There's no real checks or anything. So we have to remember that in Niger, they were heavily oppressed by the French for a very long time. And then they started fighting back against the French and against any Western power that wanted to aid France in their neo-colonialistic exploitations that the Nigerian government accused the French of doing. So now you had some of the African nations, for example, would get their weapons from the same people who they claimed were perpetuating policies to keep the nations in perpetual poverty. So now some of the northern Nigerians are saying, look, we're suffering, and we're looking at the IMF, we're looking at America, and we're looking at all these raw deals that we're getting, allegedly. It may be best to switch sides in the world's potentially multipolar global world order. It's a very interesting thing. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So what we're witnessing in Nigeria, for example, was the split between the Sahelian cultures, who are more tied into some of their brothers in the Sahel, versus the nations that were situated further south or along the coast, because you really didn't see people in the east, southeast, the Niger Delta, southwest waving Russian flags. But we see that many in the Sahel, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, are moving away from being aligned to the west and moving towards alignment with the east, the global east, if you will, Russia and all those, in China. But at the same time, you don't want to go from the from the frying pan into the fire. You need to make sure that any new deals you negotiate, you're negotiating them with the best interest of your nation. And of course, if you're a Pan-Africanist, you're negotiating it with the best interest of all African people globally, to ensure that if I'm working with you and it's harming another African group, I'm not going to work with you, because you're not working with me to truly harm someone from your group. Maybe to get better positioning, but you're not going to really seek to harm them as bad as you could. So let's go ahead and go to the next one. Of course, the government understood this message. The government is very sensitive to potential regime changes. And so people that were caught sowing these Russian flags in northern Nigeria, there was a heavy hand that came down on them. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So, of course, the defense chief came out and essentially said, hey, look, if you fly a Russian flag in Nigeria, you committed treasonable felony and will be treated as such. And for those who have seen treasonable felony before, you have to remember that's the same crime that I believe Nnamdi Kanu has been charged with. So they're basically saying, if we see you with a Russian flag, everything that came along with the trials and travails of the Nnamdi Kanu will now be put on you. That's how serious they're taking flag waving. Same with the president. The president has also come out and said, hey, look, if you talk about us switching sides, because they understand that switching sides means regime change. If this side is pro-Western and they're saying that the West is backing up a dictator, if you will, and we want that dictator removed, and we're going to side with with powers that dislike the power that you're siding with, then that means you're in fact calling for a regime change. So it made sense for the president and the chief of defense to say, hey, look, that's not going to happen. Let's go ahead and go to the next
Real,
one.
real quick, you brought up Nnamdi Kanu. How are they able to extradite him from Kenya? I know that's kind of off topic, but you know.
Well, allegedly, from what happened, according to the court in Nigeria, the court said that he was just kidnapped. There wasn't an extradition, and that's why the court that they were just in said they had to release him. They said you can't kidnap somebody and then put them into a trial, because you can't commit a crime to try someone of a crime. You have to go through the process of having him extradited, brought back, and then you put him on trial. You can't go and just kidnap him and bring him into a country. That's a really bad precedent. No court is going to really back that up, and that's one of the major hurdles that they're having in the prosecution, because I don't know if they're going to follow that court order absent a lot of pressure on them to follow the court order to release him. And hopefully that pressure doesn't come in the form of major disruptions to the security. But of course, these things are all issues that need to be dealt with delicately, that take true diplomacy to find a good resolution, rather than knee-jerk reactions that can lead to consequences that weren't thoroughly thought out. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. All right, so those who kind of analyze Nigeria understand that the northern Nigeria, you gotta understand, northern Nigeria, when you talk about politics, you're talking about northern Nigeria, right? Same way, when you talk about government, military, you're talking about northern Nigeria. When you're talking about the bulk of population in Nigeria, once again, these are just according to the census figures, you're talking about northern Nigeria. So when northern Nigeria is hinting towards potential military takeover and regime change, you have to realize that this is the same section of the country that has committed and has been behind Almost 90, upwards of 90% of the successful coups have taken place in Nigeria. So the issue is, okay, these people on the streets who are essentially saying, we want a military takeover similar to what else has occurred in the Sahel. You don't know if that's just the man on the streets or if there's elites who also agree with that. Because you have to ask yourself, how far does this belief go? Because the dangerous thing about a belief system is that it doesn't show on your face. And if you're smart and if you're very intelligent and cunning, you really don't let people know exactly what it is that you believe, because there's power in them not knowing exactly what it is that you believe. So now the real question, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. The real question is, what exactly and how exactly is the North feeling about this current dispensation, this current democratic, if you will, regime? Now, of course, admittedly, it's a flawed democracy. All of the tenets and principles of what would be obtained in Western style democracy isn't necessarily present in some of the African style democracies, to where you start to blur the line between, is this a military regime or is this a civilian regime? Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. In fact, those lines are so blurred that sometimes you don't necessarily know whether or not this is indeed a military regime or if this is indeed a civilian regime, because oftentimes many of the people who were in the military as heads of state typically do the same things that they did if and when they become a civilian leader. So experiencing Buhari as a military head of state, anybody who experienced it then will tell you that he was very similar in performance to what we experienced recently. The only difference is he was allowed to stay in power for 8 years rather than the few years he was in power in the 80s before they decided enough was enough. And you brought up Mazi Nnamdi Kanu. So, for example, there was a time when there was Umar Diko. He was alleged to be, he was in the UK, and Buhari was head of state. And rather than having him extradited, Buhari sent some secret agents to kidnap him. And so when Umar Diko walked out of his house, some guy stuck a syringe in his neck, threw him in a car, took him to the airport, threw him in a crate, got in the crate with him, and they labeled the crate as diplomatic cargo, which means it wasn't to be searched, meaning it's just going to get shipped straight back to Nigeria. So this is what Buhari did as head of state as a military head of state. Fast forward almost 30 years later, when he becomes a civilian head of state, he has problems with the Nnamdi Kanu and does something similar and has him brought to Nigeria in a very similar way. So it's interesting that you brought that up, how exactly he was brought into the country. So when people talk about Nigeria and whether or not things would be better under a civilian or a military rule, it's not about the dispensation. It's not about the system that you're putting the person in. It's about the human capital of the person that you have at the helm. That's what Nigerians are failing to realize, because Buhari was there twice and his performance was similar, which means that if the variables change but the constant is the same and you get the same result, then that means the effect of having someone as a military leader isn't necessarily the predicate factor that's going to determine how they perform. What's going to determine how they perform is something called the human capital. Now, human capital is the most important thing, because if you take somebody that's very productive, and so they have a big bank account, right? They're competent, they're very productive. You can take all the money out of their account, and the only thing you've robbed them of is a little bit of time, because with time, they'll get all that money back, because they are the factor. They are the thing that produces that side of that. They are the thing that produces that wealth, that produces those good results. It's like if you take, an athlete who's an amazing athlete and you wipe away all their stats, they can still get back in the court and drop 30 a game for the next 10 games. And their average is right back up because they're productive. It's the human capital, it's not the stats. So when we look at African leaders, it's not about whether or not they were that were the military government.
Hey, Booba, your sound is kind of going back in and out.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Still kind of muffled.
Okay.
No. Okay, go ahead. You're good now. Go ahead.
Perfect. So what I will say is this: is that once again, it's about the human capital, not necessarily whether or not Nigeria is better off under military rule or civilian rule, because we've actually seen examples. It's very rare you have a military dictator who eventually becomes president of your nation. You probably never see that in America. Anybody who does a military coup, as if it would ever happen in America, but it'd be a very small likelihood this person will be able to come back years later, 30 years later, and become a civilian president in America. In fact, that person might be jailed or exiled once we get back to democracy. So Nigeria is an interesting country in that we were able to see military dictator and his performance as a president. In several, we were able to see that with Obasanjo. We were able to see that with Muhammadu Buhari. So, in summation, once again, it's not necessarily about the system; it's about the human capital and the people that we're putting in positions of power that we're hoping are going to be competent to do a job.
Then we'll go to the next slide.
No, we're all finished.
We're finished. Okay, you're still kind of muffled. What I'll do, I'll put a link in the chat room. We'll take a couple callers. Is that okay? We'll take 2 callers. 2 callers. Is that cool?
Let's do it. Let's do it. Hey, Dennis, you got all right, looks like I'm waiting to hop back on. But in the meantime, what I'll do is I'll just make a brief note in regards to what Nigeria actually needs. Once again, Nigeria actually needs a reorientation of its collective vision. There's no collective vision as to why the different nations that make up Nigeria are in fact together. There's no real purpose that the Nigerians as a group are working towards. In fact, and things are continuing to get worse because of a lack of a collective vision or ideology. So, for example, if Nigerians actually, the government, and the people as well, because the people are the ones that make up the government. So the problem is, and it starts with the mentality of the people as a whole, because the people are the ones that make up the government. It's an oxymoron to merely blame the government, and the government is a byproduct of the people. So if the people lack a cohesive ideology that they're going to use, putting them in different positions doesn't cure the problem, because the problem is an ideology. And once that ideology or lack thereof becomes a part of the culture, the cultural fabric of the nation, that's when the nation is really in trouble. And in Nigeria, to an extent, we've reached the point that if that national cohesion through a unified ideology as to why we are together as a nation isn't found sooner than later, then the nation could potentially see the same thing that occurred with Yugoslavia occur. Now, Nigeria, for example, is different than Yugoslavia because Yugoslavia was created with a unified ideology, and that unified ideology was to have a homeland, a powerful homeland for all the Slavs in that area. Reason being is because many of the Slavs in the Balkans, if they were to be their own smaller individual ethnic nations, they could easily be swallowed up by the larger nations around them. So at a certain point, they said, okay, we're going to come together like a school of fish. But in coming together like a school of fish, they didn't get to the macro details of how they were going to be together. Of course, they had religious differences. There were Orthodox, there were Protestants, there were Catholics, there were Muslims. All in one country, there were different systems, different people, different cultures. And they didn't handle those micro issues to ensure that justice and equity were abound. And due to the fact that they couldn't address the micro issues, but they were able to take care of the macro, big pictures, but they couldn't take care of the little pictures. So it was the little pictures that eventually, the little picture, if you will, that eventually destroyed Yugoslavia as a nation. And it's just a natural progression of a nation that doesn't quite get their unifying factor together and actually work towards it.
On the door, nothing. Eventually gives up on the door. Goes to normal.
All right, can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir. I can hear you now, brother.
My bad, my laptop went dead. I'm sorry. I don't know. It was charging, but I guess I don't know what happened. I'm back now. So, guys, links in the chat room. We'll take two callers. Link is in the chat room. If you want to call in and add to the conversation, you're more than welcome to call in and give your input. Link is in the chat room. Sorry about that. And we'll wait about a minute and 30 seconds. So again, link is in the chat room.
You know, this is a very weighty topic. You know, it's an intimidating topic for people to join in on, but that's good too. Sometimes
there are a lot of people with opinions in the chat room, so I don't know why they'll be afraid to to join in.
There's a difference between typing your opinion in the chat and having to intellectually defend or actually put forth that opinion.
You got a point there. What Ebube, you think Peter Obi runs again in 2000 and what would that be? 2027? Would it be 2027?
Well, here's the thing. If the allegation is that Bola Ahmed Tinubu rigged the election, some people are maintaining that that's what happened. If they're maintaining that that is indeed what occurred, then, and this is when he wasn't president, why would it be any different? If we are indeed saying that the election was rigged, which a lot of people do allege. So if we're saying that the election was rigged in 2023 with a man who didn't have the power of the state, why wouldn't he merely just put himself back in power the same way? I mean, if that's truly the goal, if being in power is the goal, and this person was able to enthrone themselves without the power of the presidency, the incumbency, I'm a betting man that if those allegations are indeed true, then there's no way anybody can win absent them coming to the table with a threat of force.
All right, go ahead. Go ahead, Bube, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, that's it.
All right, go ahead, Mountain.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation. It was pretty good. I would like to suggest to everyone listening that they read a book like Why Nations Fail. You can also listen to that book. There's a couple other books by that same author, like In the Shadow of the Narrow Corridor. And those kinds of books, they're kind of dealing with how nations develop. Personally, I would go for a democracy. I think all the most successful nations.
You there? We lost you.
So I think you can point out.
You're go ahead. You're going.
Yeah, I would say personally, I would support democracy. I think at this point, all the most successful nations are democracies. Now, Russia, on paper, technically is a democracy. They have the vote, but it's kind of rigged. They're like Saudi Arabia, on the Iraq, there was a democracy, but it was kind of rigged. So you end up with leaders having 80, 90% of the vote. The voter turnout in America is low. I mean, most people don't, a large chunk of people don't even vote here. Then you're looking at the numbers in Nigeria that
we lost you again. You went out. You went out. We lost you.
Yeah. Sorry, man. But having some sort of a say, you know, in terms of voter turnout is pretty low. But having some sort of a say, I think is better than having no say. I think it would be better for Nigeria to partner with the West, more so than, say, a Russia or China, for a few reasons. I mean, one reason is in America, there are more Nigerians here than in Russia or China, right? They have a vote. They have citizens. A lot of them become citizens. They have votes. They can. They have a say in politics here. You have Black Americans and others that might be more supportive of Nigeria. And if the government here tries to do something really crazy with Nigeria, they're more likely to have to say something about it to avoid, so it's avoided. You know. Again, good presentation. I really just wanted to point out that book, and I think it'll help some people. It helped me at least to understand some of these issues. Also, you know.
Definitely.
Thanks again, Ebube.
No problem at all. Thank you for your time, brother.
All right, man.
Okay, guys, we'll take one more caller. Link is in the chat room. We'll take one more caller.
And just to piggyback off of what was stated, that's actually a pretty interesting read. Why nations fail.
Would you consider Nigeria a failing nation?
I would consider Nigeria a nation that either it's going in the wrong direction, just statistically. I mean, we looked at the stats, right? I mean, you're supposed to be getting better, right? You're supposed to be getting better as a nation. And so we asked the question, is Nigeria getting consistently better? Or at least are they stable? You saw how South Africa was pretty stable. Even though there were economic fluctuations, South Africa was almost stayed in the same position. Lost a little bit of ground, but not much. And so in regards to Nigeria, Nigeria is going backwards as a nation, even though the people of the nation and the capacity of the nation and the potentials of the nation are there to take it forward. So if you're not going forward, you're going backwards. And if you're going backwards, you're failing. If you're not getting better every day, you're failing.
All right. Justin, you are the last caller. Go ahead, Justin. Unmute yourself.
I think I just heard someone say that the best countries or like the best countries are democracies. I don't think that's accurate. I think first I wish that person was still on. I would have asked, bro, what is your definition of a democracy? Because there's so many, like literally before I came on, I went back to my Google and looked up what democracy means just to get my head clear, just to be sure. Because I don't think that guy had it. I don't think he was correct at all. I mean, if you really look at the way the world social structure is on a globalized level, the two countries that can compete with the best countries so far, the countries that are far from being real democracies, realistically speaking. Like what he said that the best countries are democracies. All those countries have something in common. And when those countries started out as successful nations, they were definitely not democracies. That is for sure, 100%. Even England at some point was definitely not a democracy. In fact, the time England started to have their biggest ever boom, England was definitely not a democracy. Like, people don't understand. Me personally, I'll be real with you. I don't like democracies at all based on what I see. For real, I feel like my biggest thing I see in democracy, especially as an African living in England for this long, is that democracies gives you access to the one biggest thing that is the best worst thing that can ruin you completely, and that's like this level of freedom that is too much freedom, or usually too much freedom via too much pleasure. Like I don't see, first of all, I don't think Russia is a democracy. I don't think there's much democracy about Russia. I don't think China is a democracy. I think these two nations are not democracy. These two nations are the nations that compete with the United States of America the most. And I think that the countries that are running are so-called democracies that are successful are only successful because they run on what I would describe as past glory, with England being a perfect example. I mean, just look at England. Like England is slumping in every possible way. Like you know that people like me, Nigerian immigrants, We get like literal emails and calls from like the British Army. Like people are well, we had this one Commonwealth thing where they said some of us should actually try to. It was limited spaces though to apply for the thingy joining the British armies, but they had specific positions for us because the army and the navy especially is completely messed up now. They don't even have that much people conscripting. In a non-democratic state, no one's gonna let you voluntarily join the military. They force you. You join or you die, or you run away. That's Russia basically. That's China basically. In those countries, your algorithm is being controlled. I mean, technically, in every country, your algorithm is being controlled in one way or the other. But in those countries, you're watching the media they want you to watch. It pushes the agenda of what the government wants you to see. Democracies don't typically function like that. In China, when you go on TikTok, you're seeing people do fancy electronics, how to build PCBs and stuff like that, how to use AutoCAD to build engineering designs. In this part of the world, where you go on TikTok, you see random girls on booty shorts jumping up and down, doing things they shouldn't be doing. And if people always talk about the economic aspects of this thing, how it affects running an economy. Now, let's talk about the socio-economic aspect of these things. I'll be real with you. You don't start a country with democracy and continue running with democracy if you want to run it well. That's the point I wanted to establish. The successful countries that you think are democracies didn't start out successfully as democracies at all. Democracies introduced the nation to too much pressure, especially the young people, which is basically Nigeria right now. I remember when I was in Nigeria, every single young person I knew was either drinking, smoking, scamming, or jacked off in one way or the other. One of those four things. In Russia, China, people don't do that often because your internet is controlled. Once you turn 18, you're busy with life because you've joined the military. You're learning how to use assault rifles to get shit done, to take out people and save your country. They basically serve the states more than they're serving themselves individualistically, if that makes sense.
You want to
So yeah,
respond?
that's what I wanted to say.
Go. I'm sorry. You went out. Go ahead.
Yeah, in regards to, it's a fine balance because you can't give people unbridled freedom. Uh, some people abuse that. Some people will use it to destroy others. Some people will use it to destroy themselves. There has to
Most
be
people.
restrictions. There has to be rules. There has to be laws. It can't just be anarchy. Now, as I stated earlier, there are certain nations that develop without the necessity of having a democracy, and they do well. There might be historical, cultural links or things associated with how they're doing things, or just merely the people that they are as a group. But what I believe is that being able to see, for example, Buhari operate as a military head of state and then as a civilian head of state, and being able to see Obasanjo operate as a military head of state and then later as a civilian head of state. They were both equally situated as military men and civilians, and they had very different results. So if our only experience with military rule was Buhari, then we might look at military rule differently. If our only democratic experience was Buhari, we might look at democracy differently. However, there's one constant in both of those situations. And I think I'll leave it there. That might be a good place for us to wrap up. So if you haven't hit the like button, go ahead and hit the like button. Go ahead and hit the share button. Go ahead and subscribe here. That's your ticket for admission. And Dynast, it's back to you, brother.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Hey, Ebube, where can everybody find you?
All right, you can go ahead and go over to my channel for documentaries, Up Close and Center. I haven't posted in quite some time, but the material there is still good. You should definitely check it out. A lot of replay value in there. There's a lot of gems and things that are still pertinent and constant to this day. Of course, I do own, and I'm the managing attorney and partner at the Okoli Law Group. Once again, we handle very serious legal defense issues in the Atlanta metro area. We handle everything from, of course, if you're accused of unaliving somebody or merely accused of driving drunk, we handle all of those. I just want to thank everybody for their time.
Hey, everyone, thank you so much for joining. Like, share, subscribe. Until next time, family, Dynasty Mirror Search for Huru. Peace.